Bioshock 2 is perfection. It took what was wrong with Bioshock 1 and changed it for the better, but it also kept its strongest narrative devices in the game, making it feel like how a Bioshock game should. This ultimately created a perfect version of Bioshock that I feel doesn't get enough credit, so today I want to discuss why I think that. Without further ado, let's get started. As always, we need to start at the beginning. A cutscene showcases that we are in 1958. If you recall from the lore, that is only a year before the New Year's attacks in 1959. So currently, things should be quite civil, and for the most part they are. We see a first-person view of a Big Daddy talking with a little sister, to which he follows her around the halls. She ends up running on ahead before getting caught by some thugs. Just like any Big Daddy would, he decimates the thugs with ease before being hypnotized. Afterwards, though, a woman named Sofia enters the room.
There we are. He's perfectly safe now. This is not your daughter. Do you understand? Her name is Eleanor, and she is mine. Now, kneel, please. Remove your helmet. Take the pistol. Place it against your head. Fire.
Honestly, it's a great intro, and we can learn a lot from it. Firstly, while walking with the little sister, we get a sneak peek at the Big Daddy guiding her, and it's a model we haven't seen yet in the series. On top of that, the little girl has a name, Eleanor. Throughout the series, we aren't told little sister's name, so this was done intentionally to paint her as an important character. Even further, we actually see the Big Daddy remove his helmet. This is also a first for the series. As we know, Big Daddies were regular people who had modifications done to their bodies so they could fit the role of the Big Daddy, such as voice modification, mental conditioning, and the grafting of the skin to the suit itself. But this doesn't seem to be the case. The only character who's capable of doing this is Jack in Bioshock 1, but as we know, he only needed to seem like a Big Daddy so he could bypass the facility's lockdown. If you want to see more of this, I did talk about Bioshock 1 in a previous video, which will be linked at the end of this one or in the eye in the top right now. So questions are already flooding the player's mind, and it's enough to either get them hooked immediately or at least get their attention. Mind you, this is only 3 minutes into the game, so we're starting off quite strong. Bioshock 1 had the element of surprise, as the player wasn't accustomed to Rapture just yet. That's why its sudden reveal landed so well, but doing that again wouldn't have the same effect, so Bioshock 2 needed to ramp up the intensity. And not only does the intro start off incredibly strong, it keeps going as the character we play throughout the game is a Big Daddy. Words can't describe how excited I was when seeing this. There is no doubt in my mind that at least once throughout a playthrough of Bioshock 1, you must have thought how cool it would have been to play as one. Well, our prayers have been answered, as playing as the Big Daddy is arguably the greatest feeling in the series. From the actual moment-to-moment gameplay to the interactions with the little sisters, the Big Daddy is such a great character for the player to control. As if all of this wasn't great already, the game introduces the newest character to the roster, the Big Sister. These two represent a sort of dichotomy, battling over a common goal. Quite early in the game, we take our first plasmid and come across a little sister. Since we're a Big Daddy, our duty is to obviously protect her, except the Big Sister swipes her away from us. The problem is that the Big Sisters were designed to also protect the Little Sisters. So firstly, where did she even come from? But secondly, why are they actively working against us despite having a common goal? Bioshock as a series has never shielded away from secrecy, mystery, and confusion, especially in its early moments. Already within just a few minutes, we're given multiple breadcrumb trails, and while not forced to follow said trail, why wouldn't you after going through this intro? Who is the Big Sister? Who are we? Why aren't we a normal Big Daddy? Who is Eleanor, and who is Sofia? These questions are the driving force behind why the player continues deeper into the game. Bioshock 2 had a tough job of continuing the series after the very satisfying conclusion of the previous game. It also had to get the player interested despite giving all of its secrets away in that previous game, and somehow Bioshock 2 nailed it perfectly. Some games have been able to pull this off before, but only few have been truly able to do this within a couple minutes of game time, and the fact that Bioshock 2 can replicate the same mysterious feeling of Bioshock 1 with the added penalty of having its vast world building already known by the player deserves some praise. So now that I'm done rambling about the game's mystery, I think it's time to finally explain that mystery. I've always been a sucker for lore in games if it wasn't evident by the videos on this channel, and Bioshock 2's newly added concepts and world building are utterly brilliant. Just like Bioshock 1, the majority of the story will come from audio diaries, random devices we can find throughout the world. However, Bioshock 1 ran into an issue with these devices. Many of the audio diaries focused on key characters, whether that was the main boss of an area like Dr. Steinman or was a part of Rapture's high society like Tenenbaum and Andrew Ryan. It felt like Rapture only revolved around a few people, and that never sat right with me. Bioshock 2 changes this completely, as while some notable characters will have numerous appearances throughout the game like Sofia Lamb, Andrew Ryan, and Tenenbaum, there's also a large number of audio logs made by just random people who had way more world building than Bioshock 1 ever did. We'll circle back to him in a moment, but a good example is Mark Meltzer. His audio diaries detail his investigation into Rapture and his daughter Sydney, as he believes his daughter was kidnapped and brought here for an unknown reason. Originally, it seems like just a one-off diary, but not only does just this one diary explain that people from the surface have found and invaded Rapture, but he has more diaries that show up throughout the game, and it makes you want to see the outcome of his investigation. Like I said, even if it was just a one-off diary, the fact that people like Mark can even find Rapture is incredible to begin with. Rapture was built to be away from society both far and deep enough that only those who were invited would know, yet somehow random people are able to find it, and that's a big issue. Just this one diary finally provided an astronomical amount of world building and makes Rapture feel like a living, breathing city. Besides the miscellaneous audio diaries, a good portion of them still deal with a lot of information that is necessary to understanding what's going on. So the intro was in 1958, but the game actually takes place 10 years later in 1968. We are Subject Delta and Alpha Series Big Daddy. Not only are we a part of the first line of Big Daddies, but we're the first ever Big Daddy to be bonded with a little sister. On top of this, being an Alpha Series is quite different than being a regular Big Daddy. Firstly, Alpha Series Big Daddies don't have the skin grafted to their suit, which explains why Delta could take off his helmet in the intro. Furthermore, the Alpha Series is only intended to bond with one little sister. During their creation, the person inside the suit was fitted with an unbreakable psychological bond with one little sister. Should this bond be broken by the death of the little sister or the separation of the two for an extended period of time, the Alpha Series will either collapse and enter a coma-like state or be driven mad with rage. One of the audio diaries even talks about someone seeing one of the Alpha Series Big Daddies crying at a gatherer's garden because they couldn't find their little sister. This idea clearly had many drawbacks, as the Big Daddies would be completely useless should the little sister die. This is why they changed the typical Big Daddies we see more frequently in Bioshock 1. Ones who still protect the little sisters but don't have a specific bond with a particular one, making them a bit more useful. This unbreakable bond we just discussed is why Delta is so adamant on finding Eleanor when he awakes, but clearly he wasn't just a suit of armor all his life, as we know all Big Daddies were humans at some point. In Delta's case, he was just a deep-sea diver on the surface who accidentally came across Rapture. He actually had an article written in the paper about him. Ryan didn't believe this story and thought that he was a spy, so he had him incarcerated. His old life would then come to an end when he was selected to be a part of the Big Daddy program, leaving his old name and identity behind, being only known as Delta. After the cutscene in the intro, Delta wakes up after the events of Bioshock 1, so Andrew Ryan and Fontaine are already dead. The first words we hear upon waking up are from a familiar voice: Tenenbaum. It seems that even though Rapture is practically a barren wasteland, she decided to stay behind, or at least that's what it seems like. Tenenbaum actually came back to Rapture thanks to Sofia Lamb. Rapture is an extremely captivating place, not just in ideals, but in location. Substitute out that objectivism that Andrew Ryan brought into the city and swap that with literally anything, and you can get a ultimate utopia of that ideal. Rapture is a secluded place away from the rest of the world, so literally anything involved with Rapture could have blossomed from such a location, like, let's say, a cult. Rapture in Bioshock 2 is now under new management, with Sofia Lamb being the leader who has rallied the people behind the banner of the family. You may actually recognize Sofia, as throughout the first game there was a poster showing Rapture's best and brightest, and in the back resides Sofia. Before and during her time in Rapture, she was a clinical psychiatrist. Andrew Ryan had invited her to Rapture so that she could provide counseling to the isolated members of Rapture. Overall, it sounded like a great deal for both parties involved, but Sofia quickly realized that the cause of this problem was the person who hired her to solve it, Andrew Ryan. See, Rapture under Ryan was built around objectivism, something I had completely neglected to bring up in the previous video, so thank you all in the comments for mentioning that to me. Objectivism is defined as, quote, the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. But Sofia had a more altruistic look on life, as she had hoped to enlighten the citizens of Rapture through a common good. She would do this by providing free therapy to the poor and intentionally losing at poker so she could spread her wealth to the less fortunate. Andrew Ryan actively wanted the people to push themselves and seek their true greatness on their own without anyone hindering their progress, but Sofia was actively going against that by helping others. This caused the two to clash heads on multiple occasions, even having live debates on specific topics. And it was also during this time that Sofia was actively helping the poor, and Fontaine was also trying to undermine Ryan using Fontaine futuristics. So when it was discovered that both Fontaine and Ryan were dead, it made sense that she became the newest owner. Her altruistic outlook on life also helped her gain that favor, as the people of Rapture saw her as a kind woman willing to help those who were less fortunate. But she knew this wouldn't last. She would either be overtaken by some other force of nature, or she would die from natural causes. So to continue her goals, she ended up teaching her daughter in hopes of becoming her perfect vessel. Eleanor is her daughter. Yes, the little sister that Delta had bonded with is none other than the new Queen of Rapture's daughter. It's such a great twist, and it raises the stakes of our missions tenfold. So far, this is the story of Rapture in Bioshock 2, but I've neglected to bring up Tenenbaum. As I said, Tenenbaum did leave Rapture, and so did all the little sisters, but she discovered that more girls were disappearing, so she came back to Rapture to find out someone was making little sisters again, so she came down here to put an end to it. As we remember, Tenenbaum was the creator of the little sisters, but after she realized the pain and suffering this caused, she regretted her actions and dedicated her time to stopping what she created, but now she has to do it all over again. This is the full, complete backstory that sets the foundation of Bioshock 2. It's quite a lot and can get complex at times, but this is exactly what I was looking for. I wanted Bioshock 2 to take the already established story of Bioshock 1 and make that the foundation for the sequel, and this integration exceeded my expectations. So far, we've been getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's dial it back a bit and continue where we left off in game. Currently, we're still in the early minutes of the game, and already Sofia's cult-like following is starting to show itself, as there are paintings, tributes, and murals dedicated to her. There's no shortage of these in Bioshock 2. Truly showing how far her influence goes in Rapture, and alternatively how alone and outnumbered we are again. Accompanying these tributes is a book called Unity and Metamorphosis. It's all about the creation of a perfect paradise through unity and the abandonment of the self. This also coincides with all the imagery and messages of butterflies and being reborn, just as a caterpillar is reborn into a butterfly. A butterfly is vastly different compared to a caterpillar, which is why it's considered two different insects despite being the same thing. Sophia planned on using Eleanor as a vessel for her ideologies by basically shutting her away from the world while she teaches her. She would then show the family Eleanor on how she is the first utopian who is able to abandon herself and become truly free. The problem is that Sofia has to convince the rest of Rapture to do the same, and while many are on her side, aligning yourself with her is a lot different than changing your way of thinking permanently. Thankfully, depending on how you look at it, Sofia did find a rather interesting discovery. Sofia discovered the story of Jack and realized that this mental conditioning could be used to make people uphold the common good. This proves that Sofia is just as flawed as everyone else. She is literally following in the footsteps of Fontaine and is considering using a type of conditioning that reprograms the brain and forces people not to think for themselves. Just like we talked about before, this is another example of Bioshock 2 taking key parts from the previous game and reworking it in the sequel. Now the phrase "would you kindly" isn't seen as a way to manipulate someone to do your bidding, but it's seen as a necessary step to be able to live freely in a utopia. It's these slight twists on already familiar material that makes the story very engaging again. Continuing through the level, we finally get to face off against the Big Sister, and it's here and a few other places later in the game via audio diaries where we discover where these Big Sisters came from. These Big Sisters were originally Little Sisters. The atom in their body became too problematic as they grew older, and thus the older sisters were moved into different roles. We also find out that it was the Big Sisters who were abducting the new Little Sisters from the surface, which explains the vast population of Little Sisters still in Rapture again. There isn't any other lore besides this, but it does answer a fairly good question in regards to what happens when the sisters get older. Irrational Games could have easily just said that because Rapture is so large we didn't rescue all the little sisters, thus why they're still populating the city, but this approach to its world building was a much better choice, so nice job. As we approach the end of the first area, we encounter Sofia for the first time, very similarly to how we encounter Ryan, except instead of Atlas trying to help us, it's Tenenbaum. She then explains that she can help us get to Eleanor or she can see through the camera in our helmets, except I'm not really even sure why they brought this up as it's never used again. We meet Tenenbaum one time in person, and then afterwards we never hear another word from her. We get more info on her whereabouts and time in Rapture from audio diaries again, which is a shame as these audio diaries tell us a lot of important information that I would have loved for her to elaborate on on. Now, to be fair, these audio logs are in the DLC, which we'll talk about later, but still, I wish that she would have had much more of an appearance this game. Instead, we're going to be guided by Augustus Sinclair, and I 100% blame Bioshock 1 for this because I did not trust him the entire game. He fills the exact same role as Atlas, a guy we don't know who just wants to help us for seemingly no reason. But the whole time he was talking, I was just waiting for him to backstab us, but it never came true. Upon entering the second area, we hear Eleanor's voice and discover that she can talk to us telepathically and is actively trying to aid us by bringing us gifts and plasmids. It's not clear how she can do this, but it's explained later. One thing you'll notice from playing this game is the lack of levels in Bioshock 2. The game only has 9 areas compared to its predecessor's 14, and while that's not a large difference, it's still a lesser amount, but what Bioshock 2 lacks in quantity, it makes up for in quality. Each of these levels is 3, 4, or 5 levels high, filled with rubble, objects, enemies, and other gear for the player to look at. These places feel lived in and real, which is always a nice feeling. You'll be spending much more time in these levels individually than compared to Bioshock 1. Both games did take me around the same time to complete, yet one game had less levels than the other, meaning I was spending more time in those levels engaging with the environment and dealing with puzzles and all the enemies it threw at me. Bioshock 1 also did feel quite linear at times. Places like the Proving Grounds and the Medical Pavilion were great, but some of the levels felt way too linear for the genre. All of the levels in Bioshock 2 are completely non-linear. You'll be constantly backtracking to the same places, and not only does this add to the gameplay loop of finding new enemies in the same locations, but it also plays into the story and how it's continually trying to reinforce how large these areas within Rapture are and how expansive this city really is. My only complaint is the odd amount of similarity between some of the levels, as sometimes it's hard to determine what level you're really on besides a few specific areas. Bioshock 1 really nailed the diversity of the level-to-level gameplay to where no level really looked the same. I will admit though that this is quite the subjective stance. However, something that is objectively better than before is the way the game handles the Little Sisters. In our last video talking about Bioshock 1, I mentioned that while on paper the choice of saving and harvesting the Little Sisters was cool, in practice it was extremely one-sided, as it favored rescuing the Little Sisters, thus ruining the choice of morality. Bioshock 2 reduces the number of Little Sisters from 21 down to 12. On top of this, rescuing the Little Sister requires you to defeat the Big Daddy protecting her, then escort her to 2 bodies in the level to extract Adam from. Once that's done, only then can you rescue them. This is made way more difficult thanks to Bioshock 2's amp difficulty. The game isn't impossible, but you start out with a max of 5 Eve and health slots rather than your 9 in Bioshock 1. Your weapons also don't feel nearly as powerful sometimes, and enemies do hit a lot harder, plus there's also more Big Daddies, as you'll be constantly fighting more Alpha Series versions as we get closer to the game's epilogue. Furthermore, every 4 Little Sisters that you rescue or harvest will spawn a Big Sister, who, while does drop 40 Adam, is without a doubt the hardest enemy in the game. After everything is all said and done, upon looking at the numbers, the actual difference isn't that far off. It's actually less than the previous game, with a difference of 90 Adam according to the wiki, but the tasks required to get that Adam makes harvesting seem like the much better option. As if all of this wasn't bad enough already, something we discover from the audio logs later in the game is that the Little Sisters, despite being immortal, do experience some degree of pain, as one fell over a railing and broke her leg, and when they tried to snap it back into place, it was clear from her facial reactions that she was experiencing pain. Makes you think about the next time you unload a few rockets near her when you try to take down the Big Daddy. Relating back to the story, this is what Irrational Games had intended for the first game, giving the player an easy but morally wrong option and a hard but morally right option to see if it's enough to break the player's values. Is the struggle to hold off waves of splicers enough to make you snap and just take the Atom for yourself by force? This idea also makes the ending much more important, but we'll get to that later. The fourth area of the game is Pauper's Drop, and is our first instance of a boss-like character similar to Dr. Steinman from Bioshock 1. In this area, we have Grace Holloway, who runs this section of Rapture and is eagerly waiting to kill us. According to the audio logs we find about her, Grace was a singer here in Rapture who caught the eye of a James who was enjoying her singing. He seemed to enjoy when people were real when it came to Rapture and willing to talk about its flaws. This caused him to be noticed by Ryan and then taken away, never to be heard of again. She would then hear of Sofia Lamb and how she was giving away free counseling and then was swindled into her family. She joined her group of people, and because of how important she was to Sofia, when Ryan eventually came for Sofia and locked her up in prison, she gave Eleanor to Grace so that she may look after her. However, this didn't last long, as Eleanor was kidnapped and sold to the Little Sisters orphanage, which explains how she became a Little Sister in the first place. Once she became a Little Sister, she would then bond to us, and we would then become her current guardian. This explains why Grace is extremely mad at our arrival in Pauper's Drop, claiming that we stole Eleanor from her. The reason this is relevant is because all of this information is key to understanding her character and thus determining her fate at the end of the level. Bioshock 2 introduces the option of killing or sparing 3 key people, and our first is Grace Holloway. When you enter Grace's quarters, you're given the choice of killing or sparing her. It's quite easy to just kill her and leave since she started fighting you, but given her backstory, I ultimately decided to spare her. She was just a poor and lost woman down in Rapture, and when Sofia was able to bring her out of her own hell, of course she was going to help her as much as she could. Plus, we can't blame her for not understanding the bond between Eleanor and Delta. Neither wanted to become little sisters or big daddies. Even as an Alpha Series model, yes, your skin isn't grafted to the suit, but you're still heavily spliced with Adam. And of course, as we know, most if not all the big daddies were unwilling participants. We never chose this life, but Grace doesn't know that, so we can't blame her for trying to kill us. If you spare her, she goes on to say that she was wrong about you. She still believes that Sofia isn't a liar, but she knows that she is at least wrong about Delta. Our second character is Stanley Poole at Diana's park. Still continuing to be altruistic, Sofia also had a hand in the creation of the park, which served as both an art and cultural exhibit hosted by Sofia herself. She created this as both a way for her to undermine Ryan's ideals and also a way to promote her own. Ryan's main philosophy with Rapture was a city without morals or censors, so naturally all art should be accepted in Rapture, until Sofia started using this against him and started showcasing art opposite of Ryan's ideology. This of course led to her art being censored by the general public, showing that Rapture was a place that accepted these qualities but as long as Ryan agreed to it. To make matters worse for Ryan, his own version of this was Arcadia from Bioshock 1, except Ryan charged his visitors, whereas Sofia made this exhibit free to the public. Due to this attack on his character, Ryan had enough of land and sent a spy to infiltrate her network. This spy was Stanley Poole. Stanley was quite successful in feeding information to Ryan, but so much so that it led to Sofia being imprisoned. He would then during this time use the money Sofia had to throw parties at the park in an attempt to eradicate her funds. However, during this time, Eleanor caught wind of these parties and confronted Stanley about it. Fearing he would be caught, he was the one who kidnapped Eleanor and gave her up to the Little Sisters orphanage. In the present day, Stanley has flooded the exhibit, fearing that Sofia and the other members in the family would rat him out as Ryan's spy. He stays held up in there for years until Delta arrives at the park. While we're only here to just pass by and get to Fontaine Futuristics, Stanley refuses to let us pass until we deal with all the Little Sisters. Despite all the witnesses being dead, Stanley fears that when the Little Sisters drain the victim's Adam, they'll discover the truth and relay the info back to Sofia. So he wants us to get rid of them, but by helping the Little Sisters, we can also uncover the full story for ourselves. What is shown is the info we just previously went over with him kidnapping Eleanor and throwing massive parties at Sofia's expense. When we approach Stanley, Sofia hops on the microphone and says that he is the reason we're a big daddy and that she knew for years that he was a spy. We are now once again given the option of killing or sparing him. This decision was probably the hardest one for me to do. Stanley is responsible for our new life, but he wasn't the only one at fault. He wrote the article about Delta being the mysterious deep-sea diver. The article didn't seem like it was malicious. Ryan was the only one who saw Delta as a threat, so the blame now goes to Ryan. But Ryan just simply imprisoned us. It was Sinclair who would then offer us a job at Fontaine Futuristics as a performer who tested plasmids in front of a live audience. These performances made him a candidate for the Big Daddy program, so Sinclair is now to blame. But Dr. Su Chong and Gilbert Alexander created the Big Daddy program, so they're to blame as well. Do you see where this is going? No one person is truly responsible for Delta's new life. It was just coincidence after coincidence, and he was just at the wrong places at the wrong time, every time. You could, however, claim that because he hurt Eleanor and turned her into a little sister, he should be punished, but this argument is quite shallow. All of these decisions that happened between us and Eleanor led to us being bonded together, but if something changed, then we could have been bonded with someone else. Say we arrived later or even earlier to Rapture, then Eleanor would have likely never bonded with us. So there is no argument in saying that we should harm Stanley for how we treated Eleanor, because not only did we not know her even prior to our own transformation, you could technically even argue that we should be grateful to him for bringing us together, although I don't really subscribe to that idea either. Despite this, there is a lot of reasons to not spare him, and that is because of his other actions like killing the witnesses and clearly showing that he'll do whatever it takes, including murder, to get his way. It's due to this confliction that I ultimately decided to spare Stanley. He wasn't the sole reason we're a big daddy, and the idea that we should harm him for what he did to Eleanor makes no sense either. Our third and final character is Gilbert Alexander. His introduction starts off quite different than what we're used to, as we hear an audio recording tell us to kill him, and then we see him piloting a security bot, all while yelling at a group of splicers. This is quite the twist, as we have a man who is telling us to kill him because he's going to become clinically insane, but then also having that new insane self tell us not to kill him. It's also during this level where we can meet Mark Meltzer, the guy who investigated Rapture so he could find his daughter, or it least what was left of him, anyway. It seems that despite all he went through, he was caught by Sofia and turned into a big daddy. On the plus side, however, according to the audio log that was found in his body, the little sister he bonded with was his daughter Cindy, so at least they got to be together forever, well, at least until we killed him. You don't discover that this is Mark until after his death, which makes you feel quite sad as you just tore his daughter from him, so I made it up to Mark by restoring his daughter to her former self in hopes that she can have a brighter future. It's incredible how Bioshock makes you care about Mark and Cindy, despite them rarely ever showing up. You know what happens to the little girls in Rapture, so that makes the situation even worse as we now finally got to see the other side of the coin. We're now able to see how the parents react to their daughter being taken. Bioshock 1 did this as well with another individual, but I felt it was much better handled here. Going back to Gilbert, since we have to decide his fate, the question is then, what's his story? Well, Gilbert Alexander was a researcher at Rapture who specialized in robotic and mechanical engineering. He was also the creator of the Alpha Series Big Daddies and was responsible for the unbreakable bond that they have built into them. As we know, it worked too well, making them not as efficient in protecting all the little sisters as it only made them care about one. This idea was inevitably thrown out, but due to his knowledge of the bonding process and the manufacturing of the suits, he assisted Dr. Suchong in creating the new line of Big Daddies. After some time though, he began to feel guilty about his actions. Sofia used this skill to manipulate him into being her own test subject.
Dr. Alexander has agreed to accept both measures of the new utopian project. He will become a kind of genetic chimera, host to all the minds of Rapture, accessing their talents and memories via the Adam we have gathered. And deriving in part from Project WYK, I have developed a new set of behavioral constraints. Dr. Alexander will live to promote the common good.
She wanted to use Gilbert as a test subject to see if she could create the first utopian being capable of losing self-interest and being extremely loving and loyal to the human race. This, however, did not go as planned.
I was to be Sophia Lamb's greatest achievement, a living composite of all Rapture's genius in the body of a single man, unfettered by self-interest. Now, I am nothing more to her than a failed experiment. My scores on tests of intelligence and moral reasoning are still noteworthy, but declining sharply. She has abandoned me, and I do not have long before psychosis takes me.
This is what led to Gilbert making the audio logs we hear about how to kill him once he becomes insane. After entering the core of Fontaine Futuristics, we can see him in his final form, which is this giant amalgamation inside of a water tank. It looks awful. We then, for the final time, have to decide another person's fate. This is the only person in the game I killed, and I also killed without hesitation. I deemed it as a mercy killing more than anything. This does become quite the tough argument when you consider that it's possible that after being clinically insane, he enjoyed his new life, and thus killing him would have been a bad thing. It's ultimately his words against his own, and personally I'd rather believe the version that was able to think more rationally rather than the one that was mutated beyond human recognition. That's why I felt that it was a good idea to kill him so I could rid him of his suffering and allow him to finally die. As a whole, these choices were really well done, and judging from some of the community discussions I've seen, many have chosen the alternate solutions that I didn't choose. I read many posts saying that they killed Grace Holloway for trying to fight them, that they killed Stanley for turning us into a big daddy, and some even spared Gilbert because they believed that his past self wants to die but his present self doesn't want to, and thus they spared him. This shows that these choices were well written enough that it wasn't clear what the best choice was in the moment. It makes you think about your decision and what led to things being like how they are now, and that's once again extremely impressive. After dealing with Gilbert, we make it to Persephone, which is Rapture's prison system and is also where we find Eleanor. As we approach her, Sofia stops us and locks us out. She goes on to explain that Eleanor wanted a father and tried to make one again. An audio log clears this up, but basically Eleanor has the power to control the little sisters, and through this power she managed to find a gene sample of Delta. She planned on using this sample to revive Delta through a Vita chamber, and sure enough, it worked. This explains how we survived the gunshot wound. We didn't actually survive, Eleanor just revived us. She also used the little sisters to contact Tenenbaum so that she could help us get back up on our feet. Now things are starting to make a bit more sense, but just as we're about to be let inside, Sofia smothers Eleanor with a pillow, temporarily stopping us due to our unbreakable bond. However, it was only for a specific amount of time, as Sofia obviously wants to keep Eleanor alive, as that's literally her daughter, so it wasn't enough time to kill her, but it was enough to break our bond with her. When we awake, we're strapped down and can't move, but Eleanor lets us take control of one of the little sisters so that we can unlock our own restraints. As simple as this sequence was, it was probably one of my favorites in the entire game, as we got to see the world through the eyes of the little sister for the very first time, and it truly shows how deep the mental conditioning went. They don't even see the same world that we do, it's completely different. This was more than likely made so that the girls didn't have to see the horrors of the real world and thus can continue to do their jobs without being scared. This explains why everything is so clean and new in their world, and why the big sister suit isn't a diving suit but a dress, and why there's petals instead of blood. When we do extract the blood from the splicers though, it does cut back to the real world, and I don't think this happens to the girls. I think it's just more of a game design decision to remind us that we're still in Rapture, meaning the girls after becoming little sisters never see the real world again until we save them. This was such a great section and really shows how badly their minds were altered. After using the little sister to gather the big sister suit, we give it to Eleanor, who uses it to break out of her containment and then release us as well. We also get a plasmid that can summon her from any location, which is really cool as it shows Sofia that despite the bond being physically broken, their love for one another knows no bounds. By talking with Eleanor, we discover that she has a plan, which is to take Sinclair's lifeboat up to the surface, except Sofia is trying to stop us. While trying to thwart her plans at stopping us, we run into Sinclair again, except this is not on good terms. It seems that he was captured and made into a big daddy. We can hear his voice over the radio getting more and more desperate as he tries to find a way out of the suit. He then tells us to unlock the door and finish him off. Even though he desperately wanted to live and be on the surface again, dying is better than being a controlled test subject. After getting the device from Sinclair and also helping Eleanor rescue the little sisters that are in the nearby wing, we use the little sisters by having them boil the water underneath the lifeboat so it can rise. I'll be honest, I don't remember if this was ever explained in the entire series ever, but the only thing I can assume is that they're expelling the atom in their systems, which heats the water somehow. As we finish heating the lifeboat, the explosives that Sofia planted explode and cause us to get knocked back. Thankfully, we're just barely able to latch onto the lifeboat as it floats up, and it's here where we discover the ending of the game, but it's done a bit differently this time. There are 6 possible endings, but it's all because of the combination of 2 choices. The harvesting and rescuing from Bioshock 1 returns again, but the sparing and killing of the previous characters is also a factor. There's actually a neat little flowchart someone made to help visualize them. Sparing lives actually has different weight depending on your choices with the little sisters. If you spared all the girls, then saving one character will give you the best ending, but if you harvest a couple of the little sisters, then you must spare all of them to get that same ending. This goes even further with the bad ending, as when you harvest all the little sisters, sparing the 3 characters is still not enough, and then you're stuck in the bad ending. Now this is only for determining whether or not Sofia lives. The other decision is Eleanor and Delta's fate. If you rescue all the little sisters, then Eleanor will drain Delta's atom and transfer it into her so that his memories and consciousness can live inside of her and the two can be together forever. If you harvest all the little sisters, Eleanor shows no remorse and drains all of his atom for herself, killing Delta, as she says that we taught her not to let things go to waste. However, these endings are different from Bioshock 1, and not just in the actual cutscenes, but it's how it's determined. Remember, Eleanor can control and look through the eyes of the little sisters. Because of this, she was able to witness all the rescuing and harvesting we did to them, as well as the decisions we made regarding the 3 important people we discussed before. And it's these decisions that play into the ending of the game. Whereas Bioshock 1 had a similar structure which changed the ending based on our decisions with the sisters, it's not outlandish to find this a bit odd, as some could have simply just used the sisters for extra atom to survive Rapture and had no intentions of taking the girls for themselves or using them and the splicers to rule Rapture. But with Bioshock 2, your decisions don't affect you, but your own daughter. Just as a parent can influence their child's behavior, we as the parent influenced Eleanor's outlook on life, such as whether or not people should be forgiven for their past mistakes, and a bit more directly, Eleanor got to see how caring and ruthless Delta was. Like I said earlier, when we get the bad ending, she explains how we taught her not to let things go to waste, and that bad people should be punished for their actions, no matter how small or insignificant they were. This adds another layer to the endings overall, as these aren't just decisions that affect the ending of the game, but decisions that affect Eleanor, which then affect the ending of the game. This was mind-blowing when I had looked into the endings and how they were determined, and it's just outright incredible. While the ending of Bioshock 2 marks the end of the game, it's not really the end of the game, as Bioshock 2 came with a couple DLCs, one of which was a side story called Minerva's Den. As opposed to the main game, Minerva's Den takes a bit longer to set up the story. Instead of our main character being Subject Delta, we now play as Subject Sigma, another Alpha Series Big Daddy. As we approach a tunnel, it gets blown up and we're sent into the sea floor. We hear a man on the radio named Charles Milton Porter who instructs us to find the Thinker. We then eventually get introduced to Reed Wall. Both him and Porter were the founders of this device called the Thinker, which is great except we don't know what it is. Of course, in typical Bioshock fashion, an audio log explains it instead. The Thinker is a giant computer that uses atom to process data at the speed of thought. It's the sole reason that Rapture can even operate. It's quite a neat device, but both Reed and Porter discovered it could do so much more. This is what caused a split between the two founders. Reed wanted to use the Thinker as a prediction machine so it can bet on the ball games and see the changes in the stock market. But Porter wanted to create artificial intelligence, but more specifically, he just wanted to replicate the mind of his dead wife Pearl, who died during a German bombing. During our travels through Minerva's Den, we can also find some audio logs of Tenenbaum, which explains why she disappeared during the main story. She was trying to find a cure for Adam. Adam and the sickness that comes with repeated use is the main reason Rapture turned out this way in the first place, and if Tenenbaum can find a cure, she can not only help those who are still alive within Rapture, but also be able to take this and the plasmids to the surface with the safety of knowing that whatever happened in Rapture won't happen again. She sadly hasn't gotten very far in her research, as there is still a ton of variables that require calculation, which is why she wants the Thinker, as she believes it could solve her problem instantly. This is why she works with Porter, as they both want the Thinker to survive so they can use it for good on the surface. This is a much better introduction and now provides the reason as to why we're tasked with finding the device in the first place, as we can now change the world with the Thinker. The only problem is, we don't know who we are. However, that will be explained a bit later. Sadly though, after this, there isn't much in terms of a present day story. The main game suffers the same problem, where it's really just one objective that you need to complete, like finding Eleanor, which takes the entire game. However, Bioshock 2 splits up this objective by forcing you to interact with new people and even make some decisions. Except Minerva's Den doesn't do that. From the start to the end, the main objective is to stop Reed and find the Thinker. There are no other characters present in this DLC besides Reed, Porter, Tenenbaum, and Sigma. You don't make any choices, and there is only one ending, so it's really just a long string of tedious objectives that are broken up by more combat. I said the same thing in Bioshock 1 when talking about the Arcadia and market levels. Taking into account the gameplay, the exploration, and the story, these levels flow really well and are fun to have combat encounters in, but when just looking at the story itself, it suffers. There just really isn't anything going on. It's like the DLC has a heavy focus of story in the beginning and the end of the playthrough, while the combat takes up the middle. Thankfully, the audio logs do break up some of the pace and allow for more story to creep in, but all this is story from the past. I'm talking about things that are happening in the here and now. Like once again how we learn about the three characters in the main story, then choose to spare or kill them. Or when we finally meet Eleanor, but then Sofia stops us by breaking our bond together. These are things that are happening in the present and are shaping the story. The DLC does not have any of that. The first level of the game is about going from one area to the next, grabbing items so you can open up new areas until you finally complete the whole level. This continues all the way up to the final few minutes of the game, as all we're really trying to do is just make it to the core of the central computing wing so we can find the Thinker. Throughout the whole time in this DLC, most of our interactions with these people is just Porter giving us instructions and Reed projecting a very cocky attitude because he believes that the Thinker can stop us since it can predict any outcome. Except later we discover that isn't entirely true. It is calculating what we'll do, but according to the equation, once we reach the core, it just stops. This worries him as the outcome is undetermined, something pretty much impossible to happen to the Thinker. This problem of his happens around the time we enter his office, and it's where we discover that because of this beef, Reed took it upon himself to frame Porter for a crime he didn't commit and have him thrown in jail. Since he was in jail, the Thinker would be his to control, and now he could use it for whatever he wants. But the Thinker never chose Reed, as much as he thinks this to be the case. In fact, I don't think it really chose anyone. However, it did assist Porter.
Well, Thinker, Ryan's secret police are on their way. They cooked up some kind of evidence against me. Treason, they say. I've heard what happens to folks who get disappeared, come back as one of those metal daddies. So, I'm leaving you with something to cogitate on in my absence. Inputting Rapture Departure Protocol. Figure a way to get yourself out of this city, Thinker. You've got to live on, no matter what happens to me.
So before being shipped off to prison, Porter created a program so that the Thinker could escape Reed's grasp. This makes sense, as when we enter the last few minutes of the game, Reed discovers that the Thinker wasn't working with him, but against him. It's also around this time where Reed expresses his confusion as to how Porter walked out of Persephone unscathed, and an idea came into my head, and for the very first time in this series, I finally predicted something. Because we discover that Subject Sigma is Charles Milton Porter. Going back to that Rapture Departure Protocol, the Thinker determined that the best possible way for him to to escape was to enlist the help of Porter himself. To get Sigma to follow the Thinker, he used the personality duplication program, which is what Porter designed when he tried to replicate his wife, but the Thinker instead replicated Porter's own mind. Besides being a bit of an obvious twist, I was happy that I did manage to guess this, and the plot twist in general was really nice, as it does solve the question of why Sigma is even following orders to begin with. I'm just really glad that they cleared up that question by still continuing to use the Bioshock formula of a weird plot twist that ties the whole story together. After this revelation, we get to explore Porter's office and find an audio recording of his time with AI Pearl.
I believe I'm done feeding audio recordings and personal anecdotes to the Thinker. I am set to test the personality duplication function. Target personality, Pearl Porter. Thinker, are you ready?
Yes, Milton.
Starting test. Hello, Pearl.
Hello, Milton.
How have you been?
Just wonderful, Milton. I've missed you, though. It's been so long.
Pearl, No, this isn't right. It isn't her. Thinker, stop the test.
But what's the matter, Milton?
Oh, God.
Don't you still love me?
Oh, God, I said end function, Thinker. Now! It's over.
I'll admit, I have seen this exact situation tons of time in other media, and this usually ends with the person dedicated to the machine and desperately wanting their significant other back. Porter, though, immediately recognized the problems with doing something like this, so good job on Porter for breaking the mold a bit and not succumbing to your own creation. On a more serious note, this technology, while impressive, does have some adverse effects on the user, as we heard with Porter. As great as this technology is, the duplication program should not be used ever again, and I think Porter agrees. As we go further down the lower halls of the office, we can see a memorial for Pearl, meaning he still hasn't been able to move on from the incident, and honestly, who can really blame him? At the very bottom, though, is a bathysphere, and inside is Tenenbaum. With the Thinker in good hands and the two safe from harm, Tenenbaum plans to find the cure for Adam so she could change Porter back to who he once was. After that is finished, she'll then look into all the others back in Rapture. While we don't know what exactly happens, we do see parts of the suit on the ground and someone standing by a grave, which we can assume is Porter, meaning that he was able to become a human again. Overall, we get a very happy ending. The cure for Adam is complete, meaning the residents of Rapture can eventually return to being normal again. Adam and plasmids can now be used by the general public in a safe and secure manner, and Porter was able to move on and say goodbye to his wife. It's a nice conclusion to the game, and also a nice conclusion to the Rapture story. Bioshock 2 as a whole really showcased how stellar the writing of this series is. It took the concepts from Bioshock 1 and had them fit and connect really well with new concepts introduced in Bioshock 2, which ultimately created this seamless story with very little, if any, plot holes or continuity problems. And it also managed to create a compelling story both about Delta and his journey, but all the other inhabitants like Mark Meltzer, Gilbert Alexander, Stanley, and many other characters we hear from. The actual foundation of this story was also brilliant, as Bioshock 1 introduces a ruler with a specific outlook on life and a city created based around that ideal. But then Bioshock 2 changes the narrative by introducing Sofia, a character with an outlook on life that is directly opposite of Ryan's. We then get to see these two ideologies clash and then inevitably burn by our hands once again. This is why I said in the beginning that I believe Bioshock 2 is perfect. Its story and, while not the topic of this video, its gameplay were without any flaws. It's just a shame though that this game gets overshadowed by its predecessor. I do completely understand why though, as that plot twist is one of the best if not the best in gaming history, but it's because of this attention that all our eyes are centered on the first game rather than the second, and I don't think Bioshock 2 deserves that. It took what was great about the previous game's narrative structure and applied it to its own game, while also changing things that went wrong, such as the lack of world building outside of a few key characters. Bioshock 2 is perfect, and from a story perspective, arguably even better than its previous installment. With Bioshock 2 and Minerva's Den complete, we now officially come to the end of the video, and thank you all for watching. A lot of you wanted me to discuss the sequel, and I was more than happy to do so. However, we still aren't done with Bioshock just yet, so look out in the future for a video on Bioshock Infinite. Now that there's been a few videos in this style where we go very in-depth on a game's story in particular, let me know how you like these, especially in comparison to a more typical analysis that would also cover combat and exploration. With that, make sure to like and subscribe if you're new for more videos like this, and if you haven't seen the previous video on Bioshock 1, then I highly recommend you check that out. As always, thank you to my returning viewers for coming back, and with that, take care everyone, goodbye.